I'm Marcus Smith, and this is Constant Wonder. Thanks for joining us in an ongoing quest for the awe and the wonder that await each of us every day and all around. Awe can be found in all creation, human or wild, vast or small, in spiritual encounters that move us beyond words. At the start of 2020, Chloe Dalton was working for the UK as a political advisor and foreign policy specialist. 2020, remember? We're talking about the year of COVID's emergence to disrupt all of our lives.
I went to the north of England at the start of lockdown so I could be near my parents. I was worried about their health. I had the opportunity to go and to be near them, so I chose to do that. But those sort of early months of the pandemic, I would go for walks and things when it was permissible to do so. But I was really thinking about London. I was thinking about my life and when I could go back, and I was worrying like everybody else about people around me and the forces in the world and where things were going to go. So I don't think I even really looked that closely at the landscape, which I know sounds extraordinary, but I'm happy to admit it because I was just stomping through the fields, feeling cold and thinking, when can I go back to London? You just have to imagine in the middle of nowhere in the English countryside, where in the winter months the sky is very, very low, the days are very short, and we had a really unusually cold winter. So we had a full sort of month, if not 6 weeks, of snow on the ground. The weather was so unpleasant over Christmas and in the New Year. And then there was this sudden change in the weather, the break in the weather, the temperature went up and the snow began to melt. And I went for a walk down this track and I was suddenly arrested by the sight of this tiny creature lying in the middle of the track on this grassy strip with its eyes open, smaller than the palm of my hand. And the word leveret sprung into my mind, even though I had never seen a hare before.
Chloe Dalton is author of Raising Hare, a memoir. She couldn't have known it at the time, but the moment of discovering this leveret, this baby hare, was a fork in the road for her. She would never think about the natural world in the same way again.
I mean, I, up until this point, lived my life entirely in the city. I was, like probably many of your listeners, very urban-focused and surrounded by glass and concrete.
But now she found herself far removed from the din and the bustle of Parliament and government offices. Close to a year, surrounded by open pasture land, hedgerows concealing who knows what in the way of wildlife, and dirt roads, which in Britain are commonly called tracks.
So there must have been hares in the landscape around me, but I hadn't registered them. I wasn't looking for them, and I had never knowingly seen a hare. Because I should say they're not that common in Britain. Their numbers have been reduced by 80% in a century. Even though they're kind of commonplace in our imagination and culture, they're not that common in actual life. But somehow, somewhere in my mind, I had this picture of this creature. I knew what I was looking at was not a rabbit. It was something of a completely different order.
A scientist would tell you that rabbits and hares are lagomorphs, technically of the same order in the animal kingdom, but you get Chloe's point. A hare is far from being just a big rabbit. Larger, yes, but they've got longer ears, longer hind legs, and they're faster. They don't burrow underground like rabbits, but live above ground. And Chloe was soon to learn that they dig shallow depressions called forms. And it's in these forms that they rest and hunker down to escape the elements. And one more thing, they don't live in colonies like rabbits, but alone or in pairs. On that winter day, when the weather broke and Chloe set out on yet another walk through the country, seeing an actual hare was well beyond her ken. Now, back to my conversation with her. We're going to return in just a moment to this little helpless creature that you discovered, but I'm very engaged by your description of yourself as being this foreign policy advisor. I understand you are a speechwriter for various dignitaries or officials. And your focus, you describe yourself as being far from an engaged naturalist. Was your family urban all the way back?
That's such a good question. My father, until he retired, was actually a diplomat. So he served in different parts of the Middle East. And if I think about, the nature that inspired me or things that I found awe-inspiring when I was young, it was, glimpses of the desert, seeing the Sahara, seeing, the remote interior of Libya, places like that I got an opportunity to see. And yes, we would come back to Britain for holidays and things when I was small and go to the countryside. And I loved all those things that many kids love. I wanted to learn how to make bow and arrow, and I wanted to make like little carved things out of wood. But I left all that behind. That was, for me, childhood. That was playing with my brothers and sister. And when I went to university, I was in a city, I was in Oxford. And then as soon as I graduated, I went to London. And then before I knew it, 20 years had passed, and I had just been really living in the city where there is nature if you look for it, and I now look for it much more than I ever did. But I wasn't really that conscious of the passage of the seasons, and I say that knowing that says quite a lot about me. It's perfectly possible to live in the city but be very connected to nature. But in my case, I wasn't. I was living and working and thinking about international issues, conflict, terrorism, things like that. So as you can imagine, that's all lots of kind of big diplomatic set piece things around the world, the UN Security Council, responding to crises, coming to Washington, meeting American presidents and officials and things. So I suppose if I thought about nature, it was almost as if that was that beautiful era of childhood. It wasn't something in my day-to-day life.
Well, this was not just the water you had learned to swim in. You seem to thrive in it. You seem to be really given to it, connected to it in such a way that you couldn't put the phone down in case somebody was trying to reach you.
Yeah, I look back on myself and laugh. Maybe other people feel like this. You tend to think you're absolutely indispensable and your work is so important and things rely upon you, but they probably don't. But it's just your perception at the time. And I had this incredible opportunity to serve in the British government, to be in the Foreign Office, to travel constantly. Every week I was on a plane going to a different country, usually because there was something that felt incredibly urgent. And so I was famous in family circle for it being a wedding, and I was outside juggling telephones and listening to phone calls and drafting statements in response to so-called urgent international events. And I did love it. I do, and I still do similar kind of work, and I thrive on it in many respects. But I think probably I underappreciated the extent to which the human and the animal realms depend upon each other and are connected. And I think I thought I operated in this human realm, and issues to do with conservation or wildlife were for other people. They didn't really impact upon my work.
I'm a total stranger to the particular fast lane that you're describing, but I think I can imagine it. But here you are now during the pandemic, hunkered down, essentially, in rural northern England to wait things out, to be near your parents, and the weather breaks and you go walking. Oh my, is that a leveret I see? And then the obvious question is going to be, well, what are you going to do?
I said to myself, how extraordinary. I stood away from the creature, didn't want to come close to it. I found it fascinating that it didn't run away from me. It was very, very small. It was probably only a day old, but leverets are born with their eyes open and a full coat of hair. So there's something very wild about it. It wasn't like a baby rabbit that would be at this stage in life. It would have no hair and its eyes would be closed, or even a puppy, which would obviously be a sort of helpless creature. And this, by contrast, was like seeing something from another world. It was this sort of deep, dark eyes, tiny ears that were pinned to the back of its shoulders. And it had this extraordinary coat that defied description. It was multicolored. It had this golden halo of guard hairs that stand off above the kind of thicker coat beneath. And so I stood and looked at it, and I knew, even though I was a city dweller, that generally speaking, you don't pick up young animals that are in the wild. So I assumed, looking at it and the fact that it was in a very improbable place, that it had been chased by a dog. But I thought I would leave it in the hope that it would be reunited with its mother. And so I left, and it was hours later, actually 4 hours or so later, I went back to see if it was still there and found it in exactly the same, very exposed position.
Exposed, you say?
We have a lot of buzzards in that part of the country that circle constantly on these big sweeping hunting flights in the air above. We have a lot of stoats.
Stoat is hardly a household term where I live, but Chloe has filled me in. A stoat may be weaselly, but it isn't a weasel. Its tail is bushier, and it will bound across the landscape, not just scurrying close to the ground like its cousin the weasel. Apparently, stoats are very active in the English countryside, elsewhere in Europe, too, even in the deep wintry places of North America, so it kind of seems like I'm probably the only one who never got the stoat memo. But now, a leveret found lying in the road is going to be imperiled not just by predators, but by humans as well.
Cars go past, and I thought to myself at this point, well, there's something slightly unusual about this. Maybe this creature is injured. Maybe its mother has been harmed.
Indeed, earlier that day, Chloe had heard a dog making an unusual ruckus. So she had good reason to think that that was a possibility.
So I made a decision. I thought to myself, I should take the leveret into the house, which is only 200 meters away. I should carry it in something that meant that I didn't touch its fur. And then when darkness falled, I would bring it back and put it back where I had found it. I cut handfuls of this long, dormant, sort of dead winter grass, and I wrapped it. I kind of wrapped the grass across my hands and then picked up the leveret and held it to my chest, but not touching it directly with my hands. And it didn't resist me at all. It just lay still against my chest, and I walked very carefully the few remaining meters to the house and brought it in and put it on a countertop and sort of looked it over. It didn't seem to have any visible injury, but its fur was very thick, so it would have been quite hard to tell. And it sat on my countertop, looking a little bewildered, but very, very still, didn't move at all, didn't appear frightened. And I racked my brains to think, who did I know who might know something about hares, who could give me some advice? My sister gave me the number of a conservationist and said, call him, he'll be able to give you good advice. And I rang this man who said to me, and he was just blunt about it. He said, well, I'm afraid to tell you, but this leveret will probably die. I felt absolutely awful. I felt like a proper naive Londoner who'd come along thinking that maybe I needed to be the heroine here and save this animal. And actually, I might have endangered it, because his main point was that it wouldn't be possible to return it to the field, that even if I hadn't touched it, it would still smell differently. And therefore, even if its mother were alive, that she might reject it. And of course, when I explained to him about the dog, he said that there's every possibility that the mother might have been snatched. People do chase hares with dogs.
Did you think to go after a second opinion?
Obviously, we all felt a bit more alone than usual because it was the pandemic. You can't really kind of go out to the shops or take it to a vet. And I thought to myself, what am I going to do looking at this animal? I cannot let it die. Now it's all about trying to give it the care needed to ensure its survival. Because perhaps I am a little bit stubborn, and the second that he said that it would die, I was like, no, it won't. I won't let it happen. I'm going to do everything I possibly can. Having interfered in this creature's life, I've got to do the best I can by it. But that first day was all about finding a way to feed the leveret, to house it without it feeling trapped. And so, I spent the rest of the day conferring with my sister, who has a small farm, and we had this discussion about what a leveret could or could not eat. Obviously it would need to drink milk. And I weighed the leveret, and it weighed less than 100 grams, so absolutely tiny. And my sister dropped off a big bucket of powdered milk that she used to feed lambs, and that's what I used to mix up these tiny quantities of milk to feed the leveret.
These very early days of its life, you're mixing up this powdered milk for its bottle, as you say, but what about solid food?
I wanted this hare to do all the things the hares are supposed to do, and I couldn't find much information about what that was. Obviously, it would go outside where it could eat the grass, but I came across a poet from the 1700s called William Cowper, who wrote wonderful poems about hares called like Epitaph of a Hare, things like that. And it turned out, as I did my research, that he had suffered from depression, and he'd moved to the countryside, and a neighbour's children had given him a hare that they had kept as a pet they couldn't keep anymore. And he studied these hares and wrote lots of things about them. He wrote all sorts of interesting things about what he fed his hares. And I tried everything on the list I could find in his poems, which is a slightly unorthodox way of approaching how to look after a wild animal. But it had some really good tips. And one of them was that one of his hares loved porridge oats. And so I tried dry porridge oats on the leveret, and it absolutely loved them.
Chloe got a real kick out of watching this creature eat, in no small measure because of the curious shape of its mouth, bifurcated on the upper side under the nose.
You know, the two parts of a hare's mouth can move simultaneously, so their chewing is really quite entertaining, and a tongue kind of comes out and sort of cleans off any oats that get caught on its whiskers, because they have these incredible whiskers that fan out around the cone of their nose. I used to particularly love watching the leveret when it was small eat a raspberry, because that's one thing I did put out for it, suggested by the poet Cowper who fed fruit to his leverets, and it would pick up like a little raspberry in the corner of its mouth, and because it can't eat with its paws, so it would just this little raspberry would go round and round and round and round at the edge of its lips, making this very, very sort of sweet chewing noise until it had disappeared. And I used to find it's when it was feeding in the garden, I used to love watching it to this day, in particular when it plucks flowers, so it likes to eat dandelions, but it doesn't eat them from the flower down. It snips it off at the stalk, and then it sort of gradually swallows the stalk until it gets to the very end where the head of the flower is, and then it snips off this little golden flower that falls to its paws. But for while it's eating the dandelion, the flower is kind of bobbing around in front of the leveret's nose, which is very, very enchanting, as you can imagine. So they're very, very clean animals. They wash themselves after they've eaten, absolutely meticulously, always in the same way, starting with the front paws. They lick their paws and then they clean their ears and their head, and then they go progressively down their bodies, down to their hind paws. So I would lose a lot of time in the working day watching the hare eat, groom itself, and sleep.
I want to chat with you about the question you obviously must have had about whether or not to use a cage, put it in some kind of an enclosure. You've written about this.
Those first few days and nights, I just put this little creature in a little open-sided cardboard box with lots of the grass and hay that I'd cut from the side of the road, material that I hope would be familiar to it. And it lay perfectly still in this box and would only come out, even though it was open-sided, it could leave at any time. It would only come out of its little shelter when I would pick it up to feed it. And not knowing anything really about animals and not having had any creature in my care since I was a small child and had a pet mouse or something when I was very small, I sort of approached it without preconceived notions for how I should look after it. But I just had this instinctive feeling that it didn't belong in a cage, that it was a wild animal, and that my job was just simply to prepare it to return to the wild. I didn't think of it as belonging to me. It wasn't my pet. It was this little creature that I was taking care of, and as soon as I could, I would release it. But then, of course, what happens is, you follow your instincts. But I also started to do some research, and I eventually found online an organization by a wonderful woman who's rescued lots and lots of orphaned leverets. And I think maybe for practical reasons, she recommended keeping the leveret in a cage. And we were a few weeks into the experience now, and I thought, okay, well, I better do that. I haven't done it right until now. I better get a cage. So I assembled this sort of pen. It wasn't really a cage so much as a sort of run that I put the leveret into at night. And very rapidly, I noticed a change in its behavior. It did something that it had never done before, which was to leave droppings inside the pen. And I did this for a couple of nights, and then I just suddenly thought, this is not right. These are clean animals. They deliberately keep their form absolutely clean. And I immediately knocked down the pen. And from that moment onwards, I just let the leveret have the free run of the house and the garden. So I always kept the door open so it could come and go. And from that moment onwards, it never left a single dropping anywhere in the house. It's absolutely immaculate. But that was my brief experience with the pen. And it really confirmed something which I feel very, very strongly about, which is that hares are not rabbits. They have resisted all human efforts to domesticate them. If you think about the fact that rabbits have been domesticated for thousands of years, but hares haven't. There's something about them that resists being enclosed. Some people do try to farm them. Some people do keep them as pets. But I personally think, I don't want to judge anybody, but my understanding of the life of a hare is that it would inflict quite a lot of suffering on them. They're born to run. They don't like to be enclosed. So my decision not to cage the leveret proved to be the most important decision I took in the context of our relationship, because from that point onwards, it was free, and therefore it behaved towards me with a great degree of trust.
A moment ago, you said that you let it come and go as it liked. That's quite an accommodation to make, to keep the door to the house open for it?
Yeah, well, I would feed this little creature and then I would take it out and put it on the grass. And then I'd leave the door to the room open so it could find its way back in again. And I would always notice that it didn't seem to like to be outside in the daytime because, of course, hares are actually crepuscular creatures. They're animals that are active at dusk and dawn, so not all through the night. They're not fully nocturnal, but they're most active outside daylight hours. So if I ever put the leveret outside on the grass in the sort of broad sunshine, it would look very, very sleepy. It would be like you or me being woken up at sort of 1 a.m. and told to go for a run. We would not like it, and the leveret didn't like it. But over time, it was part of the way that living alongside the leveret and trying to adjust my life to reflect its needs, that it altered my perception of nature, of indoors and outdoors, because I kept the door to the house open. My heating bills were absolutely horrendous until I worked out a permanent solution. But I never wanted this animal to ever feel trapped. So I would leave a door to the garden ajar. You hear so much more, People talk about the dawn chorus, but I don't know what the term is for the noise that all the birds make as they're going to sleep at night and they're roosting. And I would hear owls. I would feel the wind more. I started to realize all those sort of human barriers that we put up to sort of seal nature out of our nice, clean, tidy lives so that mice don't get in and the cold stays out. They kind of dampen our senses. And in so many ways, observing the leveret really reactivated my senses as I started to think and try to imagine the world through the eyes of this little creature. But just to round off your point about the door, when the leveret had been weaned, when it was about 4 months old, it learned to leap the wall around my garden. So the garden is surrounded by a fence and also by a stretch of dry stone wall that's a good 4 feet high. I mean, it's pretty tall. And this little leveret, still quite young, youthful, learnt to leap over the wall. I saw it one day standing on top of this wall and looking over into the wilderness, the wild beyond. And I waited to see what was going to happen, and it dropped off the wall into the landscape and it was gone. And I thought, having adjusted every aspect of my life for 4 months to live alongside this creature, I suddenly thought, well, this is it. It's over. The experience is over. But actually, to my total astonishment, several hours later, the leveret returned. And this is the point at which I realized that this relationship was going to continue. So I realized I was going to have to find a permanent solution. So I persuaded the carpenter to cut the world's first hare's door, cut into the pane of a large glass door in my living room. And that's kept propped open for the hare to come and go.
Now, I would like to help somebody listening to describe this, to be absolutely clear that your touching of this animal seems to have been restricted to feeding it. There was no stroking or cuddling or petting. And in fact, you would conduct your work sitting at a desk while this crepuscular creature would come in to rest during the daylight hours. But you would tiptoe essentially around this animal.
Well, yes, I didn't want to interfere in the nature of the animal. I didn't want to turn it into a pet. In fact, I really kind of resisted efforts from friends and family to say, why don't you call it this or why don't you call it that? It just didn't feel right to me. This was a wild animal, and I felt that it was the most incredible privilege for me that it would choose to come and lie in the house and rest, just meet us from the desk where I was working day after day. It would sleep there, and it would arrive and sit quite upright and clean itself and think about life, and then it would gradually kind of go lower and lower and lower until it was stretched out on its side, its eyes completely shut, its white belly showing, allowing itself to sleep in the company of a human. There's something absolutely so extraordinary about it. I did not want to wake it up. So I went to ridiculous lengths. I would go through a different door, go around the outside of the house to sort of leave the hare to sleep because it would sleep all day. And I would look across at this mysterious, beautiful, peaceful, dignified creature that was choosing to be alongside a human without being tame, without me touching it, never came and asked to be petted or anything like that. Totally self-sufficient, much more independent even than a cat, but yet seemingly happy to coexist alongside me because it felt safe. I always thought, okay, it's partly because it feels safe around me, and that's a great compliment. But also I began to be conscious of the fact that there was a deeper attachment between this creature and the land than between me and the land. And as far as the hare was concerned, it was just lying where, generations of hares before it have always lain. So it wasn't just about me and the way I treated it and the fact that I didn't impose upon it or treat it as a pet. It was also the fact that it had this strange, deep connection to the land that I could somehow sense, even if it's something that I couldn't really relate to myself as a human.
You mentioned how powerful the connection is between the hare and the land it inhabits. I just can't help but think of how vulnerable that relationship has become, especially because of things like modern farming practices. You went on a walk soon after a potato field, I believe, had been harvested. Yes. And it must have been hard to see what you saw.
Well, it was always hard. The hare would leap the wall into a world that's heavily affected by humans. There's a road just at the end of that dirt track that I mentioned. I've seen dead hares on that road. Farm vehicles would obviously come by. And even before the hare had come into my life, I'd started during the pandemic to notice how big modern agricultural vehicles are. Like I'd be in my house and they would be plowing or sowing or, spreading something on the fields. And these like huge tractors would be like bigger than my house. And I started to, when the hare had come along, to sort of perceive all this through the eyes of a hare. And one particularly traumatic episode that you mentioned was harvesting of potatoes in the field right by my house. So very much in the center of the range of this hare that I was living with. It was an incredibly rapid process, very, very efficient. These two huge machines that went along and sort of gutted the field of every last potato and left behind a wasteland, essentially. And when they had gone, I stepped out into the corner of the field and stood amid these gigantic furrows created by these very large vehicles. And within minutes, I saw my first dead hare, and not just dead, but totally mangled. Everyone obviously associates hares with speed, and that is one of their survival mechanisms, is to run. But before they run, they hide. So their first instinct when confronted by danger is to hunker down in place, to hide in their form, to try to not be seen, to use their amazing powers of camouflage. So the hares that had done this in this field while the harvest was taking place were killed. I saw several bodies of dead hares. I didn't go very far into the field. I couldn't really bear the thought, but what really distressed me was seeing a young leveret, probably about 3 or 4 weeks old, with blood on its hind legs and on its flanks. It had obviously been nicked in some kind of way by one of these machines that was sort of dragging itself down one of the furrows, but still moving too fast for me. I didn't want to try and stress it out by trying to capture it, and I don't think I would have been able to do anything for it because it was too badly injured. But I was astonished to see that just in one act, and obviously all of our countries, we've got to have food security, our populations are growing, it's very hard to make a living as a farmer. So I'm not sort of totally starry-eyed about that, but it was kind of shocking to think of what the sort of toll of life was in order for us to have those beautiful white potatoes that we like to have.
Chloe Dalton is with us, author of Raising Hare, a memoir. Now, Chloe wasn't the only human who got to observe The wonder of this wild animal as it crossed back and forth over the boundary that we perceive between domestic and wild spaces. Those other humans, they're coming up next. I'm Marcus Smith, and you're listening to Constant Wonder. I want to take a moment and recommend another show from the BYU Radio family of podcasts, The Lisa Show. With life's great onslaught, everything that can overwhelm us and add stress to our life, Lisa Valentine Clark, her guests, and Council of Moms provide a practical, positive outlook on our ongoing daily challenges. They tackle problems head-on with wisdom and experience. You'll hear suggestions for better handling interpersonal relationships, useful ideas related to health, technology, body image, family, and a host of other important issues. It's called The Lisa Show, and of course, it's available wherever you get your podcasts. We now return to Constant Wonder. There was fear and anxiety you experienced with every departure over the wall that your hair might never come back.
Yes.
How did you deal with that? How did you process that?
I felt that I was on an island of time, that I had been gifted this extraordinary experience that might come to an end at any minute. And so I treasured it, and I not only got the benefit of observing this incredibly beautiful, mysterious creature that normally humans don't get to see up close. And normally what you see of a hare is a flash in the distance as it runs away at high speed. So not only did I get to observe the habits, the pelt, the eyes, the expression, the minutiae of the life of this extraordinary animal, but my gaze followed it outside. My gaze followed it into the fields. My feet followed it into the fields. I found sometimes when it would leave at night, it would turn back and look at me. And I had this sort of strange sensation that it was waiting for me to follow it. But clearly the hare's life is not a world I can enter into. So I would stand and watch this hare disappear into the night. But because of it, I started to walk, to look the landscape differently, to look at grass, to look at color, to ask myself really simple questions about things that I'd taken for granted.
Day by day, week by week, ultimately year by year, as this hare lingered as part of her life now, Chloe realized how the animal had started to serve as a window on the wider natural world. It was a magnet for attention to far more than just itself. Eventually, Chloe could not resist the urge to share little tidbits of what she was learning with all the people around her.
I took so much joy and interest out of allowing myself time to pose really simple questions about the processes and features and phenomena and the nature around me, and to say, oh, I would love to know more, and then to share that with people. You know, then you find yourself saying, did you know? Did you know that in that meadow, which we haven't interfered with, there are all sorts of flowers and plants that our ancestors used to use to heal wounds or upset stomachs or babies that were unwell? And did you know that nature never runs out, never gives up, and keeps coming back despite all the things we do to it? So I credit the hare, which is kind of extraordinary for an animal that couldn't communicate with me, utterly silent, not a pet, that had this real transformative effect, unfurling my senses as I tried to understand what its life represented. There are all sorts of twists and turns I describe in my book, things that happened because the hare developed this extraordinary bond of trust with me. But there is this remarkable kind of cycle. This story continues in the life of this hare nearly 4 years later.
Hanging out with a hare during lockdown, or maybe it was hanging out with you, kind of sounds like it was a two-way street. Well, during that first year when the lockdown came, I'm sure that the two of you were basically alone together. But also during COVID, depending on where you were in the world, and the quarantine requirements, as we all know, would morph and shift. As days and weeks and months went by, ultimately, you were not the only person to spend time in the company of this creature. You must have had people in your home on this or that day when suddenly somebody says, oh, looky there, what's that? Guess what's coming in the door? What's going on here? So how did all of that go down with the people that came to visit?
The experience was so unusual. Certainly in my circle and in the community where I was living, nobody had raised a hare, and lots of people had opinions on the subject, and people wanted to see the hare. people would arrive at the house in the hope that they would see the hare, and the hare would bolt. I have no idea. Some people it was comfortable around. I don't know if it was like the tone of certain voices or the weight of certain footsteps. Generally speaking, it was a little bit more comfortable around women rather than men, which used to really upset my father, who's like the softest, most gentlest man you can possibly imagine. Like, why is the hare running away from me? But then sometimes I would have friends or family over and we'd be sitting in the sitting room and the hare would make an appearance, come in, eat some porridge oats or lie down for a while and then disappear, and everybody would hold their breath because they knew they were seeing up close an animal they'd never seen before themselves. Even members of my family who've lived all their lives in the countryside had not seen a hare up close. It's been sort of awe-inspiring to me to meet people up and down the country who, for various reasons, have a strong affinity and connection to hares and want to talk about their experiences. So starting with the small sort of nucleus of the family and going much further afield, this hare has touched lots of people's lives in a way I'm certainly very grateful for.
You haven't offered, pardon me here for the pun, you haven't offered a hair of foreshadowing that anything bad has happened to her. So clearly she's alive, probably quite well as we speak. But we could use a status report. You're each part of each other's life still. And that open door policy, the occasional courtesy call, what's up these days?
Not only is she still alive, but she has had leverets of her own, to my absolute delight, you know. I mean, for the first year of her life, I didn't know whether she was male or female. It's not possible to tell from looking at her hair. There's no, they call it sexual dimorphism. There's no obvious differentiation that you can tell between the male and the female of the species. But I learned that she was a female in the most wonderful way when she gave birth to leverets in the garden. And so the way the story has developed is over time is that I'm not just living with one hare, I have a family of hares around me. So I'm definitely the interloper in a world of hares.
You have touched on how your experience with this foundling opened doors to broader aspects of nature. But if we were to take that hare and just think of that as the trunk of a tree and how you branched out in your learning, I would like to go and see right at the tips of some of the twigs some discrete examples of animals and plants. Give us a short list what you've learned about.
Yes, I was pulled outdoors by a sense of joy, a sense of curiosity, a sort of childlike desire to revel in the landscape around me and just to understand basic things. And for me, it ranged from standing at the edge of the pond and gathering grasses and identifying them and trying to find out what they were used for in the past, you know, to make hats or chairs or whatever it might be, or to wicks for lamps, and trying to see how many of the traditional meadow flowers that I could identify and what they were used for and what knowledge we had about them we've currently lost when you just go to the pharmacy and buy a pill. And again, it wasn't because I could translate any of this directly into my life, but I just wanted to see how far this experience would take me if I opened my mind to it and if I started to perceive the nature around me differently. You know, one of them that springs to mind, the sort of tips of the trees, you put it so beautifully, was colour. When I began to write the book, I realised what a sort of meagre vocabulary I had for colour, because you don't really need many more than the basic primary colours when you're sort of describing things in day-to-day life. And I would look out, particularly, you know, even just the basic colour green, the shades of green, the seasons of green. And I went on a journey of trying to sort of read books about colour, understand where our concepts of colour come from and what lies behind the colours that we see in nature and how we perceive them. There was one, I went down I'd like to say a rabbit hole, but that wouldn't be appropriate for this subject, but around, climactic effects and rainbows, and why do I live in a part of the world where there just seem to be rainbows all the time? Rainbows and hares, it's a rather beautiful combination. So there was a period where I was trying to sort of learn and understand what it was that's producing a phenomena that I wouldn't otherwise really have dwelt upon. But in terms of species and plants, some of it was understanding the predators in the environment. I can now tell you confidently about stoats and the difference between stoats and weasels, but I really didn't know. I studied stoats and the fact that they have to eat absolutely continuously and that they hunt all day long and hide their meat and use it as a kind of larder so they can eat all day long. And I did this sort of species by species with the animals around me. So the birds of prey, the buzzards, the kestrels, which led me to consult old books about birds in Britain and to be absolutely horrified to realise, and I'm probably quite late to the party in this regard, but how many of them have gone. And of course, probably lots of people can either relate to the pandemic changing their life in some way or something else totally unexpected changing their life. The particular thing about the pandemic is because it held us all in place for so long, I got to observe the full cycle of the seasons in the life of the creatures around me, the birth and the death. There's an episode I describe in the book involving a death of a leveret. I was very, very affected by it. And like lots of people before me, drew lessons thinking about my own life from these experiences and from the sort of incredible transparency of the life of animals in some kind of way, if we work hard enough to get close enough to perceive it.
I have never lived in Polynesia, but when I see pictures of human dwellings there, I don't see enclosed walls. I see a lot of openness, a porosity between the dwelling space of humans and the world around them. And there you are in the northern part of England where doors get closed and windows are not always open. And you've kind of broken with that cultural convention. I guess my question is, are you going to go back to the way it used to be?
I suppose I have to recognize I'm like everybody, I get cold if there's too much cold air coming in, and I want my house to be warm and snug and welcoming to other people. But one thing I've changed, actually, now that you make me think about it, is that I don't put lights on at night in the same way that I would before, that I feel much more comfortable moving around in the dark because, well, immediately I realized that bright electric light would interfere with the night vision of the leveret. It felt like a really odd thing to do when it got dark to turn the light on. And so I started going to bed earlier. When it would get dark, I would let the light fade. I would go upstairs, I'd put the light on in my bedroom, but I would kind of move around the house in the dark. And then I realized that I was much more comfortable moving around outside in the dark and sort of intrigued by the desire to experience that. Before the advent of all modern technology, we lived closer to nature. The night sky was much purer. It's hard to find an unpolluted night sky and to see the stars or the woods as they would appear without light pollution. So I feel like when it is porous, when I was a child, I loved camping. I don't know about you, but when you do have an opportunity to escape those walls, those thick walls and windows, even though we need them for our security and our safety and our children and all the rest, it's always quite a thrill to leave them behind. And I certainly have found it quite a thrill to live a little differently for the most improbable of reasons, which is because I'm sharing my space with the wild hare.
You like London. You work in London. You now live in this former barn in the countryside from time to time. You're going back and forth. Where's your real attachment?
Oh, I would stay in my barn if I could, and I spend most of my time actually in my barn at the moment, partly because to write the book, I needed to be there and I wanted to be with the hare. I come to London reluctantly now, in a way. I mean, obviously, I still have to work, so that's why I come back. When I was writing about the attachment to place, it was partly, again, reflecting on my own sort of limitations and the way I thought about life. I, like lots of people, derived excitement and pleasure from the new, the novel, the far-flung, the exotic, going somewhere I'd never been before. And I'm so glad I got to do that and got to travel to so many countries in my work. But it is something about making your life in a place, inhabiting it fully, being part of a community, being good to the people around you and respecting the nature around you and learning from it and being kind of close to it. I don't want to oversimplify it and romanticize it. And I'm not just saying, city bad, countryside good. But what I was writing about was my sense of pleasure of planting things and watching them grow, of trying to create a space that was more appealing to the hares in the landscape and tending to my little corner of the earth. And those of us who have the privilege to have a little corner of the earth tend to, it's an extraordinary gift. That's one thing I've learned. That the other one is really the possibility of finding beauty in the commonplace. I mean, a hare is a commonplace animal. I mean, lots of people would just think of it as a big rabbit and not think there was much that was special to learn there compared to, say, looking at a lion or a tiger or some kind of exotic animal. And not only did I find this extraordinary experience just at the end of the garden, not after a 10-hour flight, but I also found it in an animal that most people would probably think isn't really worth a second look, but actually, my goodness, it is worth a second look. Lots of our assumptions about it, I think, are totally misplaced. It's a special animal that deserves more protection, although I know that there'll be some farmers who take a different point of view, but that's my point of view.
Nobody who knows this podcast well would ever be surprised to hear Marcus Smith speak enthusiastically about paying much closer attention to those things that we pass off as just mundane. So would you go so far as to say that you have experienced awe because of this humble creature? I mean, hares are not commonly seen, as you say, in England, but they're not truly exotic out in the countryside either. So any awe for this hare?
I felt lots of sensations for which awe would be the right word, just getting to understand its nature, even realizing that little leverets are born above ground and they have to survive from their first days totally exposed to the elements. And I kind of had a sense of awe about how extraordinary it is that they survive at all, anywhere, because they're so fragile and so many of them die. So as a symbol of something about the resilience of nature, despite all the things we do to it, that produced in me sensations of awe, when the result of giving this creature freedom and space was that it chose to coexist and live alongside me. And I had the sense of the wild coming closer to the human in a way that I couldn't account for, that nobody... I'm sure there are other people who've had similar experiences. I don't want to claim it to be a unique experience, but it's certainly a rare experience. It didn't need anything from me in terms of for its own survival, but somehow it chose to rest alongside a human and to live alongside a human. And because that's so contrary to everything that we have been led to believe about hares, it generated a sense that I live with still. And I had to write a book because I just wanted to understand this and to explore it. And where is this coming from? What does it mean? And can we learn broader things from it? And I wanted to document the experience. And I sometimes feel this kind of ricocheting of awe, how beautiful and remarkable these creatures are and how much about their lives that we don't really fully understand. I go back to that sort of sense that it doesn't have to be a hare, it doesn't have to be some really extraordinary experience, but it is possible to step out of our lives, sometimes in the most unexpected ways, to look around us. It's our one true shared heritage, and the impulse to look, to see, to describe, to understand, and through understanding to understand ourselves better is definitely one of the most kind of profound spiritual effects of nature, as well as it just being thrilling and exciting and fun. We shouldn't overlook that. It doesn't always have to be totally serious. Sometimes we can just have a lot of fun and joy in nature and share it with people in a way that makes wonderful, beautiful memories. So I think both those things go together, and both in a way are awe-inspiring.
Chloe Dalton is author of Raising Hare, a memoir. This episode of Constant Wonder was produced by Eric Schultzka, Mamie Teeples, and Tenery Taylor. Sound design was by James Call. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please do consider leaving a 5-star rating wherever you're listening to the podcast, or leave a friendly review or a comment. All of that really helps to get the word out about us. And as always, our sincere thanks to you for listening. I'm Marcus Smith. Constant Wonder is a production of BYU Radio. As a dad myself, I know it's a happy moment when I come across a podcast just right for the whole family. And we've got just the thing for you in the new show, Constant Wonder Kids. Constant Wonder Kids offers stories from the original BYU radio podcast, Constant Wonder, with accessible adventures for younger hearts and minds. Constant Wonder Kids goes out into wide-open nature. It's designed for curious kids, but then, of course, also for the grown-ups who love those kids. Together, you can discover fascinating facts, true stories about remarkable people we interview who have had incredible experiences in their own encounters with nature. You get to join them as they dive down far under the ocean surface to meet things like, maybe a friendly whale shark. Or back on land, you get to cheer along for tiny little hedgehogs that are athletes, if you can believe it, at the International Hedgehog Olympic Games. Constant Wonder Kids is perfect for road trips, for bedtime listening, or whenever your brain's got an itch that needs to be scratched. New episodes drop on Mondays. Tune in to Constant Wonder Kids on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. It was rewarding and gratifying to get to know Chloe Dalton as we were producing the episode of Constant Wonder that you've just heard. And of course, I hope you enjoyed it too. If you found yourself thinking, I don't know how she actually got so comfortable with moving around in the dark, remember how she decided to accommodate the needs of the Hare by not shining light on everything with artificial means in the hours of evening and darkness? Well, a lot of other people have thought this through as well, including Leanne Hennion. She was our guest earlier this year on Constant Wonder, and she's written a wonderful book titled Night Magic: Adventures Among Glowworms, Moon Gardens, and Other Marvels of the Dark. Dip in with me right now to hear part of our conversation. Leanne, my wife and I took the family to see Yellowstone National Park. This was last fall. And of course, we did the obligatory thing. We visited Old Faithful. Hundreds of people waiting expectantly, that big ring that encircles the geyser. There's a real vibe of excitement in that crowd. Few people think that watching simple flowers open up at night is going to be a match for watching a mighty geyser blow. So you genuinely get excited about things that are so simple?
I'm a PR agent for bats and a travel agent for evening primrose because you don't have to go very far, okay? That's my first selling point. They'll just grow in drainage ditches sometimes, around where I am. But, common evening primrose, they have these little latches on them that at just the right time in the evening, that latch kind of pops open and the flower just opens. And it's like watching a time-lapse video, but in person. And then you never know. Helicopter blades, hawk moths, you never know who's gonna come visit. And it is more meditative than explosive. Like Yellowstone, that's a giant awe experience. But to have the patience to kind of let your own night vision ripen, sitting with an evening primrose, it's a different kind of experience, but it's a lower energy, meditative, pretty amazing experience. And again, you don't have to go far. It's completely free, just right there in your yard. Just, who needs a little break from their screen? Who could use a little time away from artificial light? That's a good excuse to go. And also, my dad and my grandpa, they used to go fishing when I was a kid. Sometimes I would go with them and I'm like, okay, it doesn't really matter if you catch anything. This is a great excuse to just go outside and just be without having to have an excuse. You've created a mini quest. Going fishing is like creating a mini quest for yourself. And, if you have a little quest to go out and watch a night blooming flower, people can get behind a quest. So, a mini quest right in your own yard. Can you find a night blooming flower? Are you patient enough to watch it bloom? This is what the kids would say. This is your new TikTok challenge.
Leanne Hennion knows that part of the challenge is patience. That's fairly obvious, woefully lacking in our rushed society. But then there's the simple challenge of also learning how to see in the dark. Do we use our eyes differently? The answer is yes.
A lot of people think that we come into our night vision after 20 or 30 minutes of being in the dark, which is true. We gain the most of our night vision early on, but we incrementally gain night vision for hours. If you have never pointedly set out to let your night vision ripen, if you have never pointedly spent hours in the dark, focused on that intentionally.
You're talking about me. You're talking about me.
Yeah. Okay, I'm really excited to tell you this. You do not know your own powers. You have night vision that you have never fully experienced.
This is so exciting, I can't even tell you.
Because anytime, so when you have that burn of light, somebody like brings their cell phone out or flashes a flashlight into your eyes, your eyes have to start over again. Because we produce a chemical that helps us with night vision. So this is, you know what this is? This is another quest for you.
Yeah.
So quest, have you experienced your night vision? Quest, have you ever watched a nocturnal blooming flower in real time?
If you enjoyed this brief excerpt from my sit-down with Leanne Henyon, I'm certain you're going to benefit from the original full-length episode. We're available wherever you get your podcasts, and this episode was titled Not So Scary, The Dazzling Secrets of the Dark. Leanne has oodles of inspiration for you and several more great stories about wonder found in the dark.